come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I am Sid Part 2. Joining me today is...
Geek for fun.
And Steve.
And we are here to do the final episode of Geeky Gentlemen History Month 2020. Truly historic year. And of course this Geeky Gentlemen History Month, the month in which we discuss the contributions that geeky gentlemen have made to history, but that have been ignored by biased educational system, except not at all. You thought I forgot, but I did not forget. And today we're wrapping up History Month, our final episode of the year, with the topic Steve brought to the table. What is the topic, Steve?
So, I was thinking about your little intro joke you've had running for like 7 years or something like that.
I think it's like 4 or 5 at this point.
Is it really? I feel like you've been doing theme months longer than that, but maybe I'm wrong. But basically just that, which is bias in the educational system and what the fuck that is about and why it's important and what we need to do about it.
Bias in particular in the education of history, right?
Yes.
All right. Because, I mean, you can talk about it with stuff like English or with, like, languages and with, implicit biases within math and science and stuff. But I do think history is probably where it is just the most blatant, where, like, it is kind of a shame Matt isn't here because he brought up a really good example of it a couple episodes ago where he talked about, like, he got one version of history class on the Civil War and his wife, who was raised in South Carolina, got another version. And I can't help but feel like those are some of the reasons that, like, racial division is still such a big thing within this country, is because people in, like, the southern region of America, for example, get, like, a completely different view of history because they get taught completely differently, like, why the Civil War happened. For them, it's never, oh no, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. But that's not true. But they get, like, this whole thing about states' rights. And the question I always ask to that, I got it from John Green, and it is a very good question whenever someone says the Civil War was about states' rights, is to just say, a state's right to do what? And the answer is, own slaves. So yeah, fun stuff. I don't know. It's something that definitely keeps me scratching my head, sir.
Did you have any specific examples, Steve, that, like, immediately stuck out, or would you want us to try and do that? Because I think that's a good way to launch off for this.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason why history is very different than, say, biases in math or science or whatever else is I don't think anyone can accuse the biases in math of creating propaganda. In science, maybe sometimes, but it's a little bit more discreet than that. In math, it takes a little bit more, like, sociological thinking before you can figure it out. But in history, it's very deliberately propaganda in a very particular way. And it's hard to escape that on anything. Like, everything is going to be propagandistic on some level. But history education, particularly in the United States, seems to try very hard to shove down very particular narratives about the way things happened. And it's kind of funny, too, when you start looking at things like you flip through a history book from middle school and you're talking about, like, Egypt and stuff, and all the drawings and pictures in the book are of white people. Mm-hmm. Or, like, they'll talk about, like, exhibits in British museums, and they'll never get to the bigger question of, like, well, how did they get these artifacts exactly? Like, that kind of stuff I just think is very interesting, where it's like, I don't understand on a conscious level how someone could produce these writings and not think on right as they're creating them, this is clearly a skewed perspective, and it's a skewed perspective on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know.
It's
It's,
one of
go ahead, Alfie.
it's one of those it's one of those things where, because the nature of history, even up to like most recent events, is hard to. There's like a saying that goes around: there is no such thing as factual history, because even records are made by people, and they're like human error, and many things are like accounts of like how people's personalities, while you're going off of a person's interpretation, and sometimes that interpretation is like passed down by person by person by person. So like almost inherently history is biased, right? Like it is always, especially when we're going into history from different cultures and we're talking about our perspective as mainly English speaking people. Most of our history about like Japan or Greece or anywhere that isn't written in English, so even places like the Norse myths or stuff like that, there is a level of interpretation once you get past a degree of like non-practiced languages, as we keep going further and further back, and eventually the nuance becomes lost, and like there's so many variables at play where the history you get given is always someone's interpretation of said history, and therefore with said biases. Do you think there's like different levels to that are like acceptable because kind of an unavoidable problem, or do you think having opinions about history and including those biases is the most interesting thing about it?
I think that like you have to acknowledge that a lot of it is just through interpretation. You're right. I don't think there's much you can do to get away from that. Like even archaeology is a very flawed science when you get to it, because it's a lot of like guesswork and interpretation, and you have to kind of just make shit up. You know, so I think that you're right, that there is an inherent bias within the teaching of history, within just like the decision on what you decide to teach, like putting a historical event over another because you only have so much time to get through it in the semester is you know an expression of bias. But I think there's a coldness that should be necessary when approaching history that I don't think happens enough. 'Cause like I always found it interesting learning history in school, how the tone would change when covering things that happened in the history of other countries versus things that happened in the history of our country. And I don't know, Alfie, maybe you can tell me if that was a consistent thing across the pond too.
Do you mean in relation to America or just in general?
Well, like, obviously Britain is like the villain in every other, you know, history class textbook, right? And I assume that it's not seen that way, or it's not portrayed that way, or it's not emphasized that way within your own textbooks, but like, you know, like what is the tone that like Germany in World War I and World War II were talked about at like what, you know, this led to this, which is what led to the rise of this political power, which is what led to World War I. Was that tone, did you notice like a tonal shift, a change in perspective and maybe harshness of critique when talking about the history of other countries versus the history of your own?
I think what is interesting about that thing is he used a very good term about like the coldness of history, which you'd like to see more, right? And that's something that goes away the older you get. So like early history class up to like, and I'll use the American terms just because that's the majority of the listener base, up to like early high school, like the first half of high school, is like really cold. And that's because us British are like sexless fucking monks, apparently. So there's no flourishes, There's no purple prose. There's nothing done to portray a villain per se, because I think they're aware that if they do that, it'd have to be us. So it's very much, these are the facts as they happened in a very analytical, dull manner, in a way where it's just this event, dates, and as many numbers as possible, and many locations. And sometimes the locations will be a little bit like more, because I remember I've still got some of my old history books. Sometimes the locations get a little bit of like the scenic meadows were dashed with the red blood. Like, it's like you get a little bit of that, but you don't get for the actual events and figures themselves. Someone like Henry VIII, you would imagine, would have a little bit more of a descriptor to him, because he's kind of a character, like just an obscene history around it. But no, it's very straight. But then when you get past a certain point, and like if you take up history as one of your subjects, as you get older, and the teaching goes a little bit from general to more like specific, that's when you start to, I want to say, like, uncomfortably nationalistic, of like the we try to bring civilization to the natives kind of shit. And no. So like it's like when you get to the point where you can, I guess, recruit is where that shit starts to creep in. But so that's funny, but it's also kind of horrifying. So yes, I'm going to say yes and no. For the most part, it's quite stacked. Okay. But once you get later on, then we start to get into a little Britain did nothing wrong hashtag.
See, I don't know, it's interesting to me, because like growing up in the American school system, the tone that is willing to be talked about with like what the Nazis did wrong, what Rome did wrong, and why it led to like Caligula, and what the Soviets did wrong, and why it led to Stalin, and yada 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 yada. Like the tone at which those things are discussed, it's like, and here's where they screwed up, and here's where they screwed up, and like it's just kind of like a cold hard fact, like, you know, Rome kept giving too much power to its military leaders, and so the military became more loyal to the leaders as opposed to Rome itself, and so you constantly had this cycle for, you know, decades, or maybe even like centuries, of Rome getting a new dictator every time one of the generals got really, really powerful. And that's like, it kept repeating this mistake, and they could never quite squash it, and that's why, you know, that's really what led to the end of Rome. It wasn't the Visigoths. That Rome at its height would have laughed at the idea of being conquered by the Visigoths, but there was so much internal division and you know, things that were going wrong with it that they just didn't have the structure to be able to handle them anymore. And that's really interesting, and I think that's like a good... I agree with that summation. It's not maybe just because I was taught it that way, but like that summation makes sense with what I have read. With that, like, without having to, when I go back and I read Roman history and I look at the way that things stack up, yes, I see that interpretation, and I realize I was told that interpretation, but I comprehend that conclusion independently of just being told it. But the second it starts to get to American history, there'd always be this nationalistic pride of when, even when things were wrong, it was an example of how things went right. And it's odd to me because I'm not sure if that's like a propaganda thing entirely, or if that's just a very American attitude. Because you see this in history even with people who have, like, good reason to hate this country. Like, Frederick Douglass, you know, a man born into slavery, who became, like, you know, kind of the voice. Like, if there was anything right with this nation, Frederick Douglass would become president, you know? Who became the voice of the anti-slavery movement for basically the entirety of his life. He talked about how yes, he hated the American Constitution for allowing slavery, but he felt this odd contradiction of kind of loving it for its ability, because it's also the Constitution that made slavery illegal. And that would be the kind of tone that any kind of atrocity America committed would take. Like, I took a high school class, or I took 2 classes in high school with this teacher, and he was native Hawaiian. And man, when that dude talked about, like, anything, he was native Hawaiian, I'm pretty sure he was a former Marine. When that dude talked about World War II, he got, like, into it. He knew all the details. He knew all the, like, the makes of the ships, the like, we studied the battles, everything. And when that dude talked about, you know, American World War II, he very clearly had a stance of, oh no, America was the good guys. And it's kind of hard, you know, when the other side had fucking death camps, to not take that stance. But, like, he was very passionately pro-American when it came to World War II. But then in another class I took with him, we were talking about just the path of American history, and we talked about stuff like the commission established to determine whether or not Eastern Europeans were good fits for immigrating to America. And he's like, and yeah, big surprise when you put a commission to investigate a thing, look at what they determined. The answer was no. And so they started to put restrictions on Eastern Europeans immigrating to the country. So that was a big surprise, but eventually got, like, worked out. So he wouldn't shy away from, like, talking about the bad things, but he would kind of sprinkle some stuff. And the thing that has always kind of stuck in my mind is when he talked about the colonization of Hawaii, because it's a fucking nutty story if you've never looked into it. Like, literally, it's a coup by a company that wanted to sell pineapples. I'm always impressed almost by that one. Like, that is, you know, you think fucking skeevy capitalism in this day and age, they don't do coups anymore. They don't wait till the fucking queen of the nation is on a visiting tour of the Americas and then fucking take over her country. But that's what the history of Hawaii kind of, you know, slowly becoming a state was. And, like, at first the Americans are like, no, you have to give this country back, you have no right to it. And then slowly but surely it's like, oh man, look at all the exports and look at all the revenue this place brings in. Well, I guess Hawaii becoming a state is just as good as giving it back to its native governments, right? And so, like, he talked about that, and he was just very passionate about, like, how the country screwed up and just did so much wrong. But then he again let it swing back and was willing to talk more about the silver lining, the redemptive side of that. It's like, well, Hawaii was never going to be able to stand on its own forever because it was such a small island nation. It got it a lot better than a lot of other indigenous nations, and like, it's something I've always found really fascinating of this very particular American, or I guess maybe even Western attitude of, when talking about other countries, oh, we can just fucking tear them to shit and talk about exactly where they've gone wrong. Well, when talking about our own, now we got to put on the kid gloves and, like, maybe we'll bring up some of the bad stuff, but we'll immediately, like, pepper it with more context and try to make it seem somewhat okay. Whereas you never do that if you're talking about a foreign nation. Oh, and by the way, I looked it up, Steve. It's 6 years. It's 2014. You were on the first round of History Month.
Haha, so I wasn't that far off. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I think part of what happens when the sort of kid gloves go on for American history is there's this tendency to not necessarily think of things as mistakes, but as really complicated geopolitical matters, and you start getting stuck in talking points. And the talking point thing is probably what ends up taking over more than anything, where it becomes less about representing the nature of the events and more about these are the things that were said around the time. And instead of examining them on any critical level, we're just going to kind of repeat them because it's a bit simpler than getting into the complexities. And if you had the same sort of level of charity for every other country in the world that you do for American history, you probably would have a much different picture of how things go. We are very sharp and accurate about our criticisms about a lot of things all over the place, but we don't tend to do a very good job of explaining where those phenomena come from or how they're traced back to us. We spend a lot of time learning about all of the anti-Jewish laws in Nazi Germany. We don't spend any time talking about how Hitler modeled those anti-Jewish laws on Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. And when you tell that to someone, it really fucks with their mind because in their head, that timeline doesn't add up. We don't think about the concept of here is 20th century American racism and here is World War II as two concurrent things. We teach them as if they're like two separate things that just happen to happen at the same time frame, and we don't do anything to kind of connect the dots there of like, well, here's how stuff in America affects things around the world. And so it becomes really hard to criticize America under the way it's taught because it just seems like it's a lot of people trying a lot of things, and it's never taught as actions and consequences the way it is with other things, right? Like you think about, like your example earlier, the fall of the Roman Empire, and it's like, here are the sequence of events around the world and within this specific city-state that led to the fall of Rome. In America, it's a lot more just like, here are sequences of events, and the actual larger context and consequences almost never get touched on.
Mm-hmm. If I were to be generous, I'd say part of that, I think, comes because America is such a young country by comparison. Less than 250 years old, so it's hard to trace those narrative things. Because like what I just talked about with Rome, that's over like 300, 400, 500 years. So you get to like cherry pick your examples of what leads to the fall of this country. America's still a pretty young nation, 250, less than 250 years, and it's still going. Limping now, but it's still going. So I don't know. I think that might be some of the reason for that. But I think you're definitely right. It's people have a hard time accepting the problems within their own history, and that's why I think when we talk about bias in education, I think in the education of history, I think it's important to pause and consider the benefit of a cold analysis, the benefit of, maybe cold analysis is the wrong term, the benefit of a stateless analysis, the removal of propaganda from teaching, I think would be really useful. Because like, I don't know, I think if you were to teach things about America as if you're talking about a different country, like if you were just make up a fucking nation, the nation of Latveria, and in the 1930s they had a bunch of segregationist laws that Hitler really liked and decided to model and adapt for his anti-Jewish laws. Oh, that's terrible, those awful Latvians, That's kind of the reaction you'd get. I think there's probably a usefulness to that approach. And again, like I talked about this a couple episodes ago, it's just if you frame things in a certain way, you can make anything sound good and anything else sound awful. Like the example I gave was like, okay, so you have the choice between killing two people. One of them is an alcoholic who's, just an old man. He's never done anything useful in his life. He doesn't have any friends. No one likes him. And the other is a war hero, and he's a symbol of hope to millions of people. which one do you kill? And so you kind of obviously go, oh, yeah, you saved the war hero and you killed the alcoholic. And he goes, congratulations, you just killed Winston Churchill and saved Hitler, you monster. So, like, when you break things down into certain terms, it changes perspective. But I think there is a usefulness to that tool of changing perspective, because when you remove bias, you begin to see things differently. I have learned so much more about American history when I stopped going into it with the mentality of, with that learned mentality of, okay, but we're still the greatest nation on earth, right? And when you just abandon that one, like, so much changes. And I think the amount of propaganda within American history is just staggering, because regardless of the political divide, people come out of American history classes both believing that we are the greatest country on earth. And it's kind of impressive that, like, the one thing that transcends politics. I remember the Bush era, Fox News debates all came down to, well, you just admit that you hate America. And, like, the liberals at the time being like, oh, no, I could never say such a thing. But now it's just like, nah, fuck it, man. Like, we've gotten so used to that, like, the youth have grown beyond it. Now the drawing the conclusion of greatest nation on earth is kind of out the window now for at least half of the political divide. So I guess progress.
And, like, at its core... Go ahead, Steve, you got something.
No, you can go for it.
Well, like, at its core, though, like, that whole... Like, I've never got that. Like, even England, in all our hoity-toity majesty, in all our bow ties and fancy gizmos, we hate England. Like, no one would have the fucking... You said England's the greatest country on earth in, like, a pub. You'd end up with, like, no teeth by the end of the night. Like, come the fuck on!
In a
like,
pub in Britain. In a pub in London.
You can't say that in London. You fucking get fucked, mate. Like, of course we're not. We're bloody shy. Like, if you can't... I never understood, like, the fucking balls on America to really have, like, that statement, which is, like, inherently always deemed to... There is no such thing as a greatest country. What is the metric, right? Like, what are you comparing? Because, like, you can't go through anyone's ledger in the entire history of humanity and not find red. Like, it's like every single fucker on planet Earth as a continent, and fucking no matter where you are, go back far enough and you're going to find an atrocity. Like, that's just the fact of evolution, the fact of society progress taking so long as it did and how it is. It's impossible. And, like, you make a really good point here. Like, the fact that can get said and people still come away with, well, at least we're not as bad as those guys, or at least we're the shining example of progress. And, like, entire policy gets formed on this. So, like, being the castle on the hill, the shining.
Dude, like, that's that Reaganism, man. Like, it's almost parody. Like, if I put it in, like, if we did this for fucking Dragon Ball DC, right? I put it in, like, an episode of, like, a comedy show or something, of a politician is running for president and they release an ad which is nothing but pictures of them shaking people's hands and being on mountain ranges, and we just play "I'm proud to be an American" in the background, and it's the most popular political ad of all time. You'd laugh at me if I said we were going to do that for Lex Luthor running for president. You'd be like, Ian, that's stupid, it's way too on the nose, no one would buy it, it's dumb. And yet Reagan literally did it. And I remember being in a history class and seeing that political ad, and, like, I hated Reagan even then, even though I didn't know why I hated Reagan. I hated Reagan then, and fuck, man, it's like, it got me. Like, it's just hit. It's a good fucking ad. It's very, very good editing for the time. It's basically YouTube pans and crop editing at this point, but still, like, it's amazing the level of propaganda of just indoctrination in the American spirit that, like, it is seen as such a controversial thing to not love America. Steve, you had something.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
I think part of what it is you don't get a lot of mileage by educating people on the reasons why they should hate the country that they were born and raised in. You don't get a lot of mileage out of telling people to help improve their country if the premise begins with this country is a shithole. Which, I mean, it is. It is absolutely a shithole. But, like, as far as just, like, strategy goes, it's not going to get you very far. And it's not going to give you a very receptive message. And so there's definitely a fine line between trying to educate people in sort of like a cold, calculated way of like, these are just the facts, which even that's sort of a debatable concept, and trying to like channel people's care of a subject or of thing into the right direction. I remember when I was teaching one of my intro to philosophy classes, I had a kid who was like literally a Nazi in my class and like would write papers with like very clear Nazi arguments and say very disturbing things about Jewish people in concentration camps. And so I went to my advisor and asked her like, I don't know what the hell to do about this. And the advice she gave me was, it doesn't do you any good to sit there and try and argue with them about what's happening. It makes a lot more sense to say, clearly they care about something. And it's more your responsibility to try and shift the focus of what they care about as opposed to deny that the thing that they care about is worth caring about in the first place. Because you're not going to win that argument. So you might as well just redirect it almost like a gun. And I feel like you can get through to people a lot more if that's your aim. It's not to say, here's why everything you learn is a lie. It's more along the lines of, if everything you learned meant anything, then here are the actual consequences you need to learn from them. If you actually care about America and Americans, do you care about the number of Americans that are poor? Do you care about the number of Americans that go into debt for just trying to get through school? Like that kind of thing. And America does a really good job of so systematizing its educational system that those kinds of framings of the issues never actually come up. And you'd be really hard pressed to like get into a history class where they stop and explain to you things like, how did the draft in Vietnam affect poor families? Or how do you like wrestle with the fact that the infrastructure of the entire housing market in the 70s and onward is plagued by age-old deeds that says you can't sell your home to someone that isn't white?
That's a good question. I don't know. Do you think I'm onto something there though, with the idea of like, what if you paint the issue as if it's another nation? Do you think that's useful, or just does it make me feel better?
Personally, I don't think that's the way to do it. I see where you're going with that. I feel like it's a good thought experiment. I just feel like you can't like structure a history education around those kinds of things, because so much of the things you're trying to learn on history depend on where you're getting them from. Like history is literally the study of context, and so when you start breaking the context away, it feels like it's being a little disingenuous. It feels like it feels almost more like an ideological tool when you do it that way, where at least one version of it is just omitting facts. The other one's like straight up just lying to you and then telling you it was a lie.
I don't know. Maybe it's because I like magic, you know?
I mean, yeah, magic's a lie, so...
Yeah, it's just...
Fool Me Twice, Part 2.
Yeah, no, like, I like magic, so I think that, you know, theatricality and deception are powerful tools. I don't know. I think you're right. It's probably the more positive thing to talk about, you know, redirecting some of that. But at the same time, it gets difficult when you're... It gets difficult to be removed enough to be able to acknowledge and do that when you're in a place that you have to. Like, especially now, where the divisions of politics have grown to such a point that people literally live in different realities now. So it's hard to even conceive of where to go with something like that. Because even if you could get through to someone and get them to decide to listen, their question becomes, well, how do I know that's true? Where did you learn that from?
Well, and the structure of the American educational system has been so relentlessly under attack by people for so long that no one actually trusts it. So you've got people on the right that say all of the education that children are getting is cultural Marxist propaganda that hates America. And everyone on the left saying that nothing you learn in history classes is true and you need to educate yourself with radical thinkers and stuff like that. And neither one of them are entirely wrong about that either. Where you are kind of more likely to get to the real history of things outside of what you're taught in an educational classroom. And so right-wing conspiracy theorists have the right idea on a lot of things as much as people on the left do. The question just starts to become of what are the things that they think are the problem in the first place. When it comes to leftist understandings of education, a lot of the problems is people feel like the dominant capitalist ideology is not the thing that's being interrogated when you're teaching people history. Whereas on the right, it becomes more about the kinds of things of what kind of agenda are you trying to push through the history narratives that you're being told. And so it's almost like if you combined those two sorts of distrusts in the history educational system, that you'd get to something that's a little bit more critical and a little bit more skeptical. But instead you kind of just end up with two sort of warring tribalistic factions of the only truth is the truth that is handed down through your grandfathers and written in journals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it gets interesting because the way in which history is discovered, I guess, the way in which history is canonized is through what you just talked about, your grandfather's journals. It's through newspapers. It's through fucking tax documents from 300 years ago. Or 3,000 years ago even. It's through all these very mundane point of moment kind of things. It's not through these big narrative events the way we want it to be. History, academic history is not determined in the same way that Hollywood wishes it was, right? It's never just one person's story throughout the entire thing. It's never just one big battle that really seals the war or anything like that. It's all these very meticulous notes and records and everything. One of my favorite examples is there was a debate among Greek historians about Dionysus, because he was always referred to as the young god. And so they're so did Dionysus come around later in Greek history than all the other gods? Was he invented kind of after everyone else? And then someone found fucking temple records of basically just fucking Excel ledgers, the equivalent of what was taken to be donated or sacrificed for what god at a temple. And right there in a line was some goats for Zeus, some sheep for Dionysus. And it was some of the oldest records they've ever found. And so what that determined was, oh no, people have been worshiping Dionysus for as long as they've been worshiping Zeus, so that one's solved. And that's the way that history is gathered. So then when you talk about how do you teach history without bias, well, you can't teach people that. You can't. It's hard to teach a kid that compared to the narrative. We teach history based on the narrative until you get to a certain point, and then you break off and go do your actual career, or you make a terrible decision and go into history. Like all my like for a long time, I thought about getting into history, and I asked several teachers about it, and they all told me, "No, don't do it. It's awful." And I go, "Why? It sounds cool. You get to like learn about all these battles and stuff." He goes, "Yeah. You know what else I know?" And he pointed to like a house across the like out the window of the school across the street. He goes, "I know that house was built in 1952." And I'm like, "How?" And he goes, "The fucking roof. I know it because of the angle of the roof and the building materials and style of roofing that was done in the 50s. And I'm like, that's dumb. But you see the usefulness in it when you think about the actual learning of history. It's fascinating. That's why I like
This
history.
Is my gift. This is my curse. I am Roof Man.
Great history comes with great roofing knowledge.
But like that's the thing though. Like if someone told me like that, is I could pull out fucking Batman moves and be like, I know the exact angle of that roof. That's a fucking that'll get you laid, man.
Oh yeah, that's what the bitch is like. Fucking roofing knowledge.
Factoids. Trivia.
That's Alfie's fucking panty dropper. He just goes up to a babe at a party. He's like, "Hey, did you know this roof was built in 1986?"
I'm telling you, man. I know, I'm fucking telling you. You've obviously been out the game too long. Things have changed, old man.
But that is one of those things.
God, I wish I still did clips.
But that's the thing, is we have this, I guess, tendency. And what I'm interested as well is because we mentioned that like the history is formed from like documentation and like from just random the weirdest places you can imagine are like the most integral historical finds. Do you think now, like, how the hell are they going to teach 2020? Like, in the age of the internet, how do you think that will affect the bias in the education system?
It's going to be interesting because just on one level, there's worry of what is being called the digital black hole. That is kind of, I mean, it's already started, but it's continuing to come, where so much has been digitized and everything, but the records are not permanent. Like we talked about this with the idea of like, even if you were to try to archive the stuff that you considered important, just putting it on a drive and storing it somewhere doesn't necessarily mean it'll work because drives break down over time. So there's this digital black hole kind of coming and existing, you know, and try to go to your favorite website from 2003. Let me know how that works out for you. And so like even ignoring that, like let's say that some fucking wacko was just running a printer 24/7 that prints off every single tweet from every single account of note. Yeah, even that's going to be hard because tweets have the potential to be very informative because you can know what fucking like Arnold Schwarzenegger ate for breakfast that morning. But they don't necessarily they aren't the kind of thing that people would necessarily like because historians want stuff that's more point of fact, that's more mundane than that. And tweets have a very inherent political bias. Like I remember learning about some battles in Egypt and like the text took a minute to know. It's like the Egyptians were pretty bad about reporting their own casualties. They didn't like to do it. So they mentioned some because they wanted to at least present the idea that it was a struggle, because otherwise they'd come off like it wasn't believable. But they'd also really, really polish up the numbers to make them very presentable. So it'd be like, oh, our army went in and we slaughtered the other army, didn't leave a man alive, and we only lost 20 men in the process. It's like, I don't think that's what happened, but it's a lot of stuff like that. So historians don't like sources like that, and that's what 90% of Twitter is. So I don't know. That's a good question of what the hell they're gonna do about trying to determine what happened in 2020.
Well, and when you say stuff like accounts of note with Twitter and mundane things about Twitter, the thing that really scares me about trying to archive history going forward when you say things like social media is algorithms. Mm-hmm. And how ideologies that are baked into algorithms are going to start coding what the meanings and what the important events are in the first place before we even get to interpreting the events themselves. And so you'll very easily slip into this thing where like we design algorithms of like who are the important people worth following, what are the important keywords, what are the important things that are going to filter out, and you compile a list of like say 1 million tweets. And instead of examining the common thread between all of them that was the bias of the algorithm, you'll just take all of those as your point of fact objective sources and start making conclusions off of that. And that's a really scary notion. Not to mention how some people, specifically with the way Donald Trump's presidency went, how many tweets count as like actual legal actions and how they hold up in court and how they hold up as like actual political documents, especially if they can't be sourced on any sort of like material level, where clearly this is an important historical thing when the president of the United States announced a transgender ban in the military over Twitter. And everyone just kind of had to scramble and come up with a plan of it on paper after the tweet. So, like, what counts as the actual historical event?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's... And Steve, it's been a long 4 years. There's so much shit. Like, how did I forget that happened? You know?
It's one of those things where it's like, it was never actually a problem until it became a problem.
I know. Just so much fucking went down. And, like, that's the other thing, is, like, one of the other sources of history is, like, even if it comes with bias, is, like, all right, you look at, like, what person A says, and even though they identify on this end of the political spectrum, they're talking about the same thing here. They're talking about the same issue. So let's take the election, for example. We talked about the election too much. What's something else? Fucking Supreme Court. I don't know. Let's talk about, like, seats on the Supreme Court. And someone 50 years from now wants to write why the Supreme Court was disintegrated, and they decide to trace it all the way back to Donald Trump's presidency. And they, like, look at the sources, and so you've got the start of Donald Trump's presidency with the Merrick Garland issue. Merrick Garland is appointed to the court by Obama, but McConnell and company dragged their feet on it for 11 months or some shit till a Republican is put in office, and then they throw Merrick Garland out and put in Neil Gorsuch. And in order to put in Neil Gorsuch, they changed the rules of confirmation to not require a supermajority in the Senate, but just a simple majority. And then that has a cascading effect to putting a rapist on the court next, and then a cascading effect to putting a fucking religious nutcase on the court next. And then so now Biden comes in office, and now Biden's going to put the most boring fucking nobodies on the court if he ever even gets the opportunity. So the court keeps going further right, and it devolves, and over the next 50 years, it's like the determination just becomes throughout the Supreme Court. It's not worth saving anymore. Who fucking knows? So someone goes back and they want to source all of that. They're going to look at what Republicans at the time were saying. What was Mitch McConnell's argument for holding up the nomination? He goes, oh, well, the election was coming, but then 4 years later, an election's coming. Well, we really need to rush this one through, and it's okay this time because everybody is a Republican now. And it's just, it's a fucking hot mess. So that's what Mitch McConnell would say, and there'd be your source one. Then you'd get like your fucking Biden or Harris or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and their arguments for why they shouldn't have put Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. And so you look at these two things, and they'd be talking about the same fundamental thing of whether or not this person should be appointed to the court, and you try to glean like what are the details of fact they agree on. This person has been nominated. There is a vacancy left by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's your points of fact that are undisputable, despite political bias. And then you try to glean as much as you can from that, and then maybe take some of the interpretations, some of the bias, and put an asterisk next to that as you present the points. But the problem becomes, in 2020, we're at such a fundamental difference in reality that it's not just whether or not Amy Coney Barrett can be appointed, should be appointed, should have been appointed. It's a matter of like, is Amy Coney Barrett a person? It's gonna be a question like, was it an actual person, or was it just like a name via meme that they gave to this phenomenon of the Republicans appointing people? That seems like a legitimate possibility at a certain point because of just the stark contrast in the acceptance of reality that we've got here. Like the hot new thing that I see a lot of lefties doing, and I mean, I'll say myself, yeah, it feels pretty good, is sipping on the tears and being like, yeah, well, you might not like it, but it's the way it shook out, so now you have to deal with it, just like we did for the last 4 years. But at the same time, there seems to be this simultaneous rejection of other realities, which is like, Trump appointed these people. These people are there. And like, even if you go further back, I remember in the days after 2016, Trump is not my president. Like, I remember people saying that. I'm like, no, that's the problem. He is. You must accept the reality, because if you don't, if you just live in this like sense that, oh no, it doesn't really count because Russia and the popular vote and electoral college, and none of that matters. Like, he may have like bullied and cheated his way in, but he still got in. It still happened. Like, believe me, 2016 was not the worst election in history. So like there's this idea of like, oh well, it doesn't really count. That comes in, and now you've got the Republican side of the aisle trying to do the same thing of, oh, Biden isn't really the president because mail-in voting shouldn't count, and yada yada. Like, whether or not you like it, just regardless of your political orientation, does not matter. You have to accept what the reality is. And like, from a historical perspective, yes, Donald Trump was president. I don't care if he cheated and spit in somebody's eye to get there. He was. Now Biden is going to be. There's certain things that just need to be accepted, and so that's where I think the real problem is going to be. Is like, I don't even think bias is gonna, like, bias of what you're going to teach is going to matter at a certain point when you start to talk about 2020, because now the realities are so different. It's going to be bias in just trying to determine what actually happened. It's a nightmare.
And the thing with that as well is you then get into like the whole Facebook thing, right? And like how that has right, is because is like I've been able to secure a base there, being able to spread misinformation so quick and so fast and so immediately, and then have that trickle down to where now individual people will be spreading information on their timelines individually and so on and so forth. And this is the same thing that happened with Brexit. Is I don't know how the hell historical students going to be able to go decode fucking Brexit and like, yeah, we had a PM who was gonna do the vote just as like a thing, is gonna cancel and go through. Didn't think they'd get that far, and then they got that far, so then they resigned, and then we had an election, and no one thought Boris Johnson was gonna win, but then he won, and Boris Johnson didn't think he was gonna get that far, so he had to delay, and he had to delay the date because he couldn't get a deal, so it was just a fucking mess. And now that we're here, a lot of that was to do with not just like the British media as being incredibly fucking corrupt and blatantly racist and misogynist, and it's ridiculous the amount of things you could see on like a headline under the sun. But that became such a, I guess, standard point of people's lives, and people had such a blur that if you could, very similar to the 2016 election, is you can ask someone on the street, okay, what do you do? What do you think about Brexit and what do you think? Because it was such a constant and it was such a blur for people, is no one can really recall what actually happened at all, like just like in the now. So being able to look at from a historical perspective is going to be interesting, because we might actually have some fucking clarity on what happened, but also it might be worse. It might just be such a information overload actually becomes physically impossible to tell the truth from reality. Whereas with history, because there is such a lack of information, you can kind of reliably gauge on the sources. We might have the opposite problem, whereas now there's just too much to sift through.
Well, and the thing that really scares me is, specifically talk about like Facebook and the Brexit example, is the kind of attitude we have when it comes to these tools and how we relate to them and how we gain our information from them. I remember the day after Brexit, the most searched thing on Google was, what is Brexit? And a majority of those search queries came from the UK, which is terrifying on a number of levels. But it does kind of go to show the problem here, which is a sincere lack of information. And I mean, you can make a distinction here between just people knowing things like data and information, which is actionable things. I mean, the NSA makes this argument when they got put up on charges for spying on everyone, and their argument was, well, all we did was collect data. If we ever used any of that data, then it would be information and therefore a breach of privacy. But since we didn't actually act on it and only compile the data, then technically we didn't actually breach anyone's privacy, which is a bullshit argument, but somehow it worked. But you start thinking about like how there is this relationship and how we sort of gain our judgments for these things. And so like, it's very easy for me to be like, look at how dumb British people are voting for Brexit and then Googling and not knowing what Brexit is. And not looking at the larger thing, which is how come we can actually reliably take the word of search engines or social media sites as things as point of facts. And so like you see now on Twitter and Facebook, specifically on Twitter though, every time Donald Trump tweets something, it comes with this little like, this claim is disputed thing. And a lot of people's tweets are getting tagged the same way, generally when they're trying to spread misinformation about the election. And the problem here really quickly becomes, why do we and can we and should we let Twitter decide whether or not certain information is disputed or true or not? Like, giving Twitter that authority on any level, regardless of how it's acting, is a scary, scary thought. If you go back to the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg had his hearing, the first thing that happened was he said that Cambridge Analytica was a bad actor, that Facebook is a certain kind of tool, algorithms a certain kind of tool, Cambridge Analytica abused that action. And like one of the first or second questions he got was, how did they abuse Facebook's algorithm or proprietary technology? And after the Senate asked him that question, it became really, really clear to anyone that was paying attention that Facebook basically just won the argument. Like, if this was a debate, that Facebook just easily wiped the floor because the first question that was asked basically took for fact the premise of Facebook's entire argument, which is Facebook is not to blame for anything. It is individual people and individual actors who use the tool. And when you give Facebook the sort of authority to do that it can't be held accountable, only the individual people on it can be held accountable, and then you've denied the entire point of the hearing in the first place, which is Facebook is the problem. So, like, what was the point of, like, the 4 hours of questioning after that when the very first question basically said Facebook is not to blame?
I also think it's interesting, though, because the other side of that argument is, well, look what happened when they were hands-off, right? You know, the big controversy of everything Donald Trump tweets about the election coming with a little bloop, 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 is, oh, well, you know, should we be giving Twitter that power? I mean, sure, that's a really good point, but at the same time, when they just were hands-off, it presented everything as if it had the same value. So you'd have crazy conspiracy theory Al saying, you know, the fucking Holocaust didn't happen. And then you'd have a historian, someone that fucking, I don't know, director of the Holocaust Museum, underneath in 50 replies explaining, yes, it did, here's the evidence, and yada, yada, yada. And Twitter as a platform just kind of put both those things out there as if they were equal value of it's just people's opinions, when one clearly is baseless and the other is not.
Well, but I think the thing there is we should not be giving Twitter and Facebook the ability and the moral responsibility to police itself. We should be policing them. So, like, yeah, Facebook can say, or Twitter can say, here are everything and they have equal standing. Or they can say, here are the things that we ideologically dispute. But Twitter should never be the one to have that power at all. It should not be the one to say these two claims stand on equal footing with each other, nor should it be the one to say one's better than the other, because that's not Twitter's job. And if you give Twitter agency, you've immediately fallen into the trap, which is Twitter's not a thing that can have agency.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. It's just, obviously something needs to change, but yeah, I agree. The change that has been made is troubling, and possibly more troubling than the problem it was created to solve. I don't know. It's a complicated fucking issue. To
kind of rope this back around to history, it's going to be a weird thing too, where as technology evolves, we don't necessarily teach the impact of technology on our historical process. We don't, in school, teach why there is a lame duck session between the November election and the January inauguration, even though it has everything to do with, well, it was the 1700s and it took you 3 months to put a cabinet together. Like, that's why. But we don't talk about it that way. We don't talk about how certain technologies like cars changed labor laws, or how factories changed the way cities were built, or like how very like sort of basic lived technological experiences are the motivations between any number of advances in history. We don't talk a lot about how evolution in gun technology is how wars were changed, how wars were fought differently, with the exception of like very vaguely touching on how like trench warfare in World War II was important. And so like when we can hear sort of talk about like the terrifying nature of social media and Facebook and stuff, but like 40 years from now, when people in classrooms have never known an existence outside of the social media sphere, can we even trust history departments to like teach that there was a world before social media?
Yeah, what was Caesar's Twitter account like? I wonder. You know, that's what I want.
Yeah, like legit. Like, will you be in a classroom and we'll be like, so back in like 2005, there wasn't a Twitter.
But like, how did they post their breakfast to all their followers? They didn't. It was a simpler time.
Yeah, it's a very, very different thing. And even that like goes into like a number of like weird ways in which schools police their students. Where like, you know, when I was growing up in elementary school and middle school, no one really like had the issue of silence your cell phones in class or the teacher's going to take your cell phone. When I got to high school, that became a really, really big thing. And I know people younger than me are like, schools have very strict rules about testing and having cell phones and stuff like that. Where does it go in 2040 when these kinds of things are just sort of assumed as part of who you are? Like there was a very limited run in movie theaters where they started testing out putting on the screen, please turn off your cell phones. And then like literally 2 years later, they changed the verbiage on like every theater I've ever been to where it's like, just silence your cell phones. We know you won't turn it off, but just silence it. And now the movie theater chains are dying and the pandemic's going on and everything like that. Like we've just sort of given up on any social graces that existed prior to cell phones at all. Like you don't sit in the living room with your significant other or your friend and be like, hey, can you turn your phone off while we're watching this? Like that's just not a thing.
Yeah. Nah, it's creepy. It's weird.
Hey, could you your stone and sickle could you put it, you know, while we're watching the do you wanna, while we're watching the dinosaurs maul each other, you wanna put that away? No, you don't do that. Like it is one of those things where I'm interested and I'm kind of terrified. Like Brutus's group chat before Caesar got killed was wild. It looked like the Teen Titans roll thing, I'll tell you that. But like there's an inherent kind of, because like yes is like how will they teach history will in a world like beyond that, but at the same time is like how does that become relevant to a society and a human experience that is so radically different, right? Like I think what needs to be the focus is less so the terror of technological process. I think that is an inherent scary thing, but I also think that's an inherently beautiful thing, is that we are always going to evolve what it means to be human, because the human experience is going to change, and history is part of the human experience and your memories, and who knows what crazy shit we'll have by that, and how, especially once you include like VR, like people get VR history at some point, like all of that is its own kind of worms. But just in terms of like how we talk about from a pre-social media age to now, and children born in this, they don't really need to know exactly what it means to live in a pre-social media age, because barring the apocalypse, that's never going to help them, aside from like an intellectual curiosity or like some kind of thing that's not useful to their experience. History, in terms of being actually useful to people, is to how can we apply it, how can we learn from the failures of this, and how can we avoid repeating the bad stuff, or what are some elements that were dropped that we could have continued to go, and all of that. Social media is such a prevailing thing where it's kind of like the invention of the gun. I think is the biggest thing that I can compare it to. Is you'll have things like, people say like the pen or like writing, but like it took a while for that to go over the place. But like weapons technology is kind of, you feel that shit immediately, because if people start winning wars effectively without losing as many people, they start having more wars, and if they have more wars, then they'll have to have more victories, and then have more land, and then those people will be changed. And so that the invention of the gun is kind of the thing that, once it became widespread, is like it's impossible to go back. And we don't need to learn about what life was like before guns were a thing, because we can't put that fucking genie in the bottle away, no matter what Bruce Wayne desperately tries to. So like, I think social media is more like that. I think it's just like, yes, that is a thing that exists, but it's almost like an irrelevant concern, because the point is moot. There's no answer to that question.
Well, and the sort of pushback I give there is just in the sense that, like, I think it's very useless to argue about, is technology always good or is technology always bad, because I think that, like you said, we're never going to be away from it, and it's going to just always change based on our human experiences, and that's kind of what technology is designed to be. It's designed to be a tool, and it's co-constitutive. Technology has this thing called multi-stability, where it can be a lot of things at the same time. And so, like, what it means to be a fork in my hand as I eat is equal parts what the fork is and what I am. What it means to be a fork with a toddler is equal parts what the toddler is and what the fork is. So, you know, I could use it to eat, the toddler could use it to play, a guy can use it to stab people, and in all of those occasions, it's a toy, it's a tool, and it's a murder weapon. And so it's that relationship that's interesting, it's that relationship that's worth interrogating. The problem starts to show up when you stop noticing how the technologies you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis are altering what it means to be a human being. Because they're always going to affect your humanity. It's just a matter of being able to assess where that's happening and where that's a good thing and where that's a bad thing. You know, like I can't get around without my glasses, and I need my glasses to see. But if I was always focused on my glasses, then I would never actually be able to see. When you start talking about social media and like how it's just going to expand and keep going, the worry just starts to become like, how much do we take for granted that it exists? And then how much do we take for granted what we've become as people because it just exists? At what point do we break away from all of our living rooms looking exactly the same way because we're all designing it to be optimally staring at the television? At what point do we break away from certain ideas of like how often it's socially acceptable to check your Twitter feed or to post things and that kind of stuff, where the more normal a technology becomes, the harder it's able to tell where it stops existing and you start existing. And if we're not able to at least a little bit push back on that, then things get very, very dangerous because those technologies have ideologies that are baked in. They have certain preferences and ideas that will always be there. Like an automatic door closer that shuts the door behind you no matter who's behind it has a certain kind of preference for people that can walk at a normal pace, quote unquote, versus grandma who's on a walker that needs to take a second. And not being aware of its ability and deferring our moral responsibility to whatever the technology is doing as quote unquote normal is legitimately a scary thing.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's the not the inherent bias of the educational system, the inherent biases of the technology of the educational system is what we actually need to tackle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to that, and I like the door closer example because it's true.
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things where when you talk about history, it gets really hard because history is, of course, the study of people, of what we did, where we've gone, where we've been. So like, it's never over. Like it is possible to talk about a complete history of the Roman Empire. But not really. Because you know what's still a thing because of the Roman Empire? Fucking the Vatican. Like that is still an ongoing part of the Roman Empire in a really big way. The Vatican exists and exists as it does because of Rome. That's weird. So even the Roman Empire isn't complete. You can talk about, like, I guess maybe the complete history of nations that have completely fallen and don't have any kind of remnant left. I guess you could conceivably do that, but then you get a problem because unless that nation just burned alive and every single person that was a part of it died, that it's not necessarily the case that nation's over, because it could continue on with the people that were raised in it and affect things. Perfect example of that. The Soviet Union is gone. It is now Russia, under control of someone who is an agent of the Soviet Union. I love the fact that Putin was a KGB officer. Like, that's It's beautiful. You couldn't ask for a more perfect example than that of the fact that that history's never over. So there's so much like that, where yeah, we could talk about the biases that are going to be introduced by technology, but like once we're all fucking cyborgs and you just choose to get your phone and plant it in your fucking hand so you get the cool like 5-screen version. You just, I don't know, it gets really complicated because it's never over, so you're always evolving the thing.
I don't have a ton more to say. I did want to raise this question though, which is how we feel about documentaries being shown in classrooms and whether or not that's an effective way to teach history or if it's responsible for part of the biases we're talking about. Because I think there's going to be no arrangement of any sort of like artistic tool that isn't going to have a bias on some level. It doesn't matter if it's a book, a movie, a teacher, whatever. But I think with documentaries and film, just in general, with the sort of like economical storytelling that they are designed for, that history books don't have to have a narrative through line. They don't have to have themes. It's a little bit easier to sort of piece those things together on your own versus a documentary or a film that sort of has to have those things, that it has to have a point it's trying to hammer home, that the editing will do things to you and imply things to you that are not there when you're reading a book. It seems at least just a little bit more irresponsible to educate someone on a controversial thing by just giving them watch a documentary as opposed to giving them a book to read.
Yes, but I'd also like, because there's a difference here between like what is an effective method of and resource of information and what is an effective teaching tool. Now, Steve, you actually were a teacher, so feel free to correct me if I'm talking completely out of my ass. But I feel like that the difference with documentaries and what have is they're a good tool to get people invested. When you learn things, and I learned this the hard way when I was like taking up law as a thing, it's very, as a human being, unless you actually have some kind of interest in something, it's very hard to care enough to retain the information. And how the school system tend to try and do that is they make you have like your life will be on the line because we have exams and there is a due date, so this is why you care. But in terms of like getting someone to legitimately deep dive out of just like sheer intellectual curiosity, I think sometimes you do need like you need that bit of Hollywood magic. You need that inciting incident to make them at least somewhat have that kind of like, oh, that's an interesting story, or oh, that's an interesting person, I'd like to know more about them, I saw this documentary about them, that's interesting. I think as a learning tool, they actually do more good than bad, specifically because they manage to, at least on a general populist level, you're gonna get at least a better understanding from people rather than like zero if it was just they didn't exist and you had to read the books.
So I agree with your argument, except I feel like I could apply it to something else where I think if it came down between me showing somebody a video or a book and I couldn't get them a book, instead of a documentary, I would just show them a movie. I feel like if the purpose is to sort of incite a passion for something, an understanding of a theme, an inciting incident of something of historical relevance that gives it humanity and scope, I'd rather just give you something that's straight up fake, isn't pretending like it's not fake, but gives you the right sort of like moral direction around it, as opposed to something that is about the truth and is intentionally structured in a way to hide the bias it has.
See, I'm like almost the exact opposite. Like, I've watched a lot of films in school because, yay, American education. Like, a documentary will do stuff to hide bias, but like I feel like people, I feel like the vast majority of people aren't sophisticated enough to comprehend that when it comes to film being so biased. You know, I legitimately feel that people take away more from film as fact than they do documentaries. Like, because documentaries are still kind of sort of boring, so they don't get, like, as invested in it. Like, they might learn more about it from a documentary because they still see it as a bit on the boring side, whereas a film, they'll kind of accept, you know, lock, stock, and barrel. Like, I would love for a history class to show Inglourious Bastards. and see people walk out of it thinking that Hitler died in a movie theater. Because I legitimately think that would happen. I think that people would be more willing to accept something as fact if it's stated in a film, because I've seen that. And I mean, I think that's you don't even need film. You can go back with that. The best example is The Life and Times of Christopher Columbus, which is the autobiography of Christopher Columbus that stated that the reason that he set sail was to prove that the Earth was round. What, in fact, he did so in 1492, you know, the year that they invented the globe. So, you know, like, that is a historical myth that has stuck around because people have read it in books and seen it in movies. And I think that a movie will do more to damage understanding of history because of its inherent biases than a documentary will.
I guess my pushback is documentaries have the same sort of ideological problems as textbooks. And at the very least, movies don't pretend like those problems don't exist inside of themselves. And so if my choice came down between a textbook documentary version of history that doesn't even pretend like it's not obscuring things, and a dramatization that at least gives someone a sort of excitement about the subject, I'd rather go with the excitement about the subject, because I can course correct and shape and shift and mold someone that's been given a base, as opposed to regurgitatings of facts in linear thought that create a narrative that people are not even conscious that it's creating. I think one can be more systematically sinister than the other, where everything that we're saying about American textbooks applies to documentary filmmaking. And so if it's really a choice between the documentary and the textbook, you're really not doing anything very different. Whereas with the dramatization in the movie, because everyone knows it's fake, even if they accept it as fact, the conversation is open to, okay, here's what it got wrong, and it's easier to accept that it made these mistakes because you know it's a movie and you're not going to fight back on it. You're not going to have right-wing people say, me correcting a movie for being fiction is me pushing an agenda, as opposed to me showing a documentary.
Mm-hmm. It's a tricky thing. I don't know. I think I'd still like documentaries more, just because they don't get stuff just blatantly wrong for the effect as much as movies do. Like, there's just this tendency in movies to change things to make them more impactful, which on some level, yeah, sure, go ahead, I guess. It's the stronger narrative decision, maybe, but sometimes I wonder, like, could you just show the actual thing? Because maybe you could just, try and make the actual facts compelling just to see what it's like. Because sometimes when movies do that, it is actually cooler. Like, not a fan of him, but Mel Gibson made a point about, I can't remember the fucking name of the movie. Andrew Garfield was in it. It's about this pacifist who is drafted in World War II and becomes a medic and yada, yada, yada. And he's like, Mel Gibson made the point while he was making that movie. He's like, no, I had to change things because some of the actual details are just too unbelievable even for film. And I'm like, no, show me the actual details. Stop it.
The movie's an interesting example because it's just so bizarrely skewed for like a Christian right-wing audience.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just it's interesting how those things tend to line up and happen. I don't know. I think about that a lot, of the fact that like changes are made for quote unquote narrative stability and narrative strength when the actual history is far more interesting, like just from a narrative perspective. So I never understand that one. That one always has me, scratching my noggin. But that's an entirely different thing. And I mean, you're right. Like, all the problems that exist with textbooks exist with documentaries, and maybe even more so because of the documentary's attempt at narrative. But I don't know. I'd put on fucking samurai versus Spartan soldier in a history class. I'd play that one. Can't remember the name of that series, but I actually quite liked it.
I also just think, and this maybe is my last little thing, is it seems like history is just a subject that everyone's fascinated by, but no one kind of wants to put the work into learning properly. Especially when you get into like other subjects where like no subject seems to take teaching of its own history very seriously anymore, and that's a real shame.
Yes.
Like, we don't teach history of philosophy anymore. You have to like legitimately work to try and figure that shit out, and it's obnoxious. Even though the entire history of philosophy is like an ongoing conversation where you'd think you'd have to know what the person before this person said, and they just literally don't tell you. We don't teach the history of science. We don't teach the history of sociology. We don't teach the history of psychology. That one is particularly fucked when you start thinking about like eugenics and torture experiments and stuff like that. We just like pretend like all of this has been fully formed from the get-go, and that's super problematic.
A little bit. I don't know. It's a whole ball of wax, man.
A whole ball of wax?
Yeah, you never heard that phrase? Is that like a new American phrase for you to learn right there?
I'm not gonna learn it because it's
Weird.
For you to take in and conceive of for the first time? I don't know.
Yeah,
It's a thing. I promise. It's a whole ball of wax. That's a thing, right, Steve? You've heard that.
See, now we
No.
see Ian's
I don't
own
know what that
revisionist
means.
history. This
You
is
never heard that?
revisionist. He's trying to pretend this is a thing where he clearly made this up on the spot.
No, that's a whole ball of wax. I swear
In
it's
the
a phrase.
comments, decide
why a
who
ball
do
of
you
wax?
believe?
I don't know,
Alfie
man.
the Truth Taylor or Sid Fake News Part 2? Trust me, I know this as the part. If I had never heard of it before, then clearly it must be wrong.
The whole ball of wax means the whole thing, everything. The whole ball of wax is an American idiom of uncertain origin. So far, it has been traced back to at least the 1880s.
Please, I can tell you. I've been reading your prose for weeks, Ian. That's bullshit.
No, that's a Google search. So now we're back to putting too much stock into Google searches.
Exactly. Steven just debunked you. Get it on the screen. Da boom, boom.
It's a thing. I don't know. Maybe it's a Midwestern or Southern thing. I don't know.
It's like a bless your heart kind of thing where like it only makes sense when certain people say it.
I guess. I don't know. Alfie has made me feel so self-conscious for just like the way words are said.
Good.
Occasionally I'll
This
just
is
say
part of my
something.
plan. I'll
Well, he
throw you
speaks
off your
the King's
game.
English, so you know.
Yeah, he speaks the King's English, which is,
Why?
fucking garbage.
Why?
Fucking get your U's out of the words that are unnecessary.
What you mean Tuesday?
Is anyone else just bothered by the fact that the word Q is the letter Q followed by like 4 silent letters?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it looks cute.
There's a really good song by the Bare Naked Ladies called Crazy ABCs, where he goes through the ABCs, but everything is like A is for aisle, and he just keeps going with things that start with silent letters.
Oh, that's obnoxious. I hate that.
It's pretty good, not gonna lie. He really has to stretch to find some of them. Q is for cat. QAT.
Damn, that's cute. Okay.
Yeah. Alrighty. Anyway, well, I guess we've come to the thing. So here's my question. I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is going to be, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. Do we want to do holiday month? Because before you answer, because if we do, we're not going to have Steve for 4 weeks. Because that's how it's happened every year. Is we decide to do holiday month because Steve really wants to do it, and then Steve runs away for 4 weeks. I don't think Steve has ever been on one holiday month episode of Geeky Gentleman. I'm like,
No, I got this. I am here for this.
This is the intervention. Like, okay, I'll be the deciding factor, because like if he runs away, the one place he can't run away from is Teen Titans because he's the fearless leader. So if he doesn't make it to an episode, I'm gonna make sure that Robin will have like a -3 debuff on all of his rolls.
The other thing you could do is you could just not announce holiday month, and we just keep conveniently picking holiday things, and at the end of it, like, by the way, it's been holiday month the whole time.
All right, so Ian, edit this whole segment out.
it doesn't do me any
we're
good
doing
if it's to. It doesn't do me any good if like the whole reason is to like hide it from Steve, who is now, you know.
Steve, like, I don't
Get
know,
the fucking
man.
Men
Like,
in Black thing real quick.
is there like a ravine near your house or something you could just like jump and like hit your head?
No, wait, hold on,
There he
Alfie.
is.
Alfie, I think I've got this. You ready? Hey, yo, Steve. Zurinar.
Shit.
Okay. You fucking mad. I wasn't gonna go that hardcore, but
Now, the Steve part is dead, and the pure unadulterated Christmas spirit has taken over.
no, you know, like the fucking what? You know what happens when the Steve part dies? You become the Death God Storm.
So much cringe, so much
That's
edge.
I'm never gonna let you live that one.
Either. I fucking got that because I made up my own Bleach character too.
Oh, you were the original What If YouTuber.
Alrighty, so we'll do holiday month, and I think it's my pick. Is it my pick or is it your pick, Alfie?
Yeah, let's say it's yours.
Okay. God, what the fuck do I want to review? There's this. I can't remember the name of it, so that's fun.
Wow.
There's a new Black Christmas movie on Netflix. Not a, because Black Christmas is its own franchise. There's a new Black People, the Christmas movie on Netflix that I've kind of been interested in. So we're going to talk about that. It's going to be 2 white guys, 1 mixed guy, and 1 Indian guy talking about a Black American Christmas film. So that should be fun.
What?
I first
Go wrong.
I'm sorry, what?
I was like, what could go wrong?
Right.
Do you have any like vague recollection of what it's called? Just for the sake of like Netflix has a lot of movies, man.
I mean, it's a new one. They've been like promoting it. It's not the one with what's his name as Santa Claus.
This is so unspecific. I have no idea what you're saying.
I can't believe Ian fucking straight up said, "Oh yeah, there's a movie about Christmas and there's black people in it." No, you know the one.
No, it's like it's been advertised. Jingle Jangle: A Christmas Journey. There we
the
go.
musical. Okay, hell yeah.
Yeah, it's a new Black People Christmas movie.
Don't put that on the fucking DVD box, man. Like,
I mean, that's clearly what it is. It's funny because this is kind of what I want to talk about is the fact that like Hollywood is so bad about still to this day about giving Black people like major roles in films that like they've just had to directors and producers and stuff that have made it in Hollywood that are black have to like go out of their way to make things with black people. So it's like that's kind of why I want to talk about it is you can't just have the other one that you could maybe confuse it for because it's Netflix exclusive Christmas movie is The Christmas Chronicles with Jeff Bridges as Santa Claus, as far as just vaguely Netflix Christmas movie. Like, so Netflix instead of producing, you know, the Christmas Chronicles 2 and having like a black family be the main characters or something, is decided to continue down the route of, well, let's just make another Christmas movie that's for the black people, and we'll just put all of our black people in it, and that's fine. And that's like, it's a whole thing that's still going on in Hollywood, and I'm infinitely fascinated by it. Yeah. So that's why I want to talk about that specifically, is because fucking racial politics.
Nothing says holidays like racism.
Yep, pretty much. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm the philosopher.
I am the champion of the oppressed.
And I am the dark magician.
Nani?
This will be a different Yu-Gi-Oh card every episode, I promise you.
And we are your geeky gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.